Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Well, for a time there, Bishop Vigano was actually kicked off of Twitter. That's right, the Twitter that we've been led to believe is sort of open to conservative voices and so on and so forth. And Michael Matt tweeted the following. He said, just got off the phone with Archbishop Vigano, who informed me that he was being thrown off Twitter. So I guess free speech is fine here as long as it's the right kind of speech. Well, that was short-lived because not too far after that, Bishop Vigano was actually back on. And if I can find his... Find it right there. And ta-da! Miraculously, he's back. So anyway, that was interesting because, well, it looked like another, strong Catholic, Christian, conservative, right-wing voice being kicked off of Twitter. But thankfully, I don't know what the reasoning was. Perhaps he might come out and say what it was. Oh, Bishop Vigano would follow me. Well, that's good. I should probably follow back. But in any case, he was off. Now he's back. Something more interesting, though, about what Bishop Vigano has been up to. He gave an interview, excuse me, with an Italian outlet called, with a writer called Aldo Maria Valli. And in fact, se ci sono qualcuno che parlano italiano, uno dei miei libri è tradotto in italiano, è disponibile su questo sito di web. So, one of my books, Lockdown with the Devil, is actually available in Italian at Aldo Maria Valli's website, if you want to find that there. Just a little interesting tidbit if you're an Italian reader. But there's some things in this interview that I find really fascinating. I want to go over some of the ideas. And let's just go through this article sort of piece by piece here. So this is a question from Aldo Maria Valli, and he said, Your Excellency, here some say that among these last cardinals there could be the successor of Francis. Do you share? Well, meaning, do you share this opinion? And he said a lot of things, but one of the things that he said was, he thinks that the next conclave will constitute a provocation. And he said, excuse me, almost all the cardinals were created in the image and likeness of Bergoglio, and they will be the ones to choose his successor. Perhaps he is alive, given the new trend of renunciation. If the voters had even a minimum of love for the church, they would have to make themselves docile to the actions of the Holy Ghost. But we know that this conglomeration of heretics, with rare exceptions, has no intention of letting the Lord do it, because if he did so, he would seal his own condemnation. So Bishop Vigano doesn't really think many of the cardinals are up to the task as far as electing a new pope that would be conservative at all. And Valli continues and he says, what do you think the reasoning is for this sort of action by Pope Francis? This is the million-dollar question. And he says, Bergoglio's logic is very evident. He wants to create the premises for a schism. And here's the part that I found most interesting in this interview, and this is kind of the meat of it. He said, the progressive restrictions on the celebration of the ancient liturgy serve to confine conservatories to hunting reserves. This is very interesting language. To then channel them towards the Society of St. Pius X. Essentially what he's saying is getting rid of the TLM and suppressing the traditional communities, of which most traditional communities are still fine as far as the fraternity and institute's concerned, except in certain places like in Chicago with Supich. But he thinks that basically the idea is kind of what Taylor Marshall has said, is to corral them into these SSPX ghettos. Let's put it that way. And he says eventually he thinks it's going to get stronger, suppressing these traditional communities that are not the SSPX. And he says at that point, that is when the traditional Catholics have migrated into the society and its leaders believe they have won a victory over the competition from the suppressed Summorum Pontificum, a new intolerable provocation will force at least one parade of the SSPX to distance themselves from the Bergoglian Rome, sanctioning the excommunication of traditionalism, no longer represented within the official church. Basically, what he's saying here is he believes that this idea of corralling people to go to the SSPX is to provoke some sort of schism excommunication situation where the church pushes too far, or the officials, the hierarchs of the church push too far, and then all the trads are in one place, which he said could lead to other sorts of excommunications. I'm not really sure what he meant when he said one parade of the society to distance themselves from Bergoglian Rome. Maybe he foresees some sort of resistance thing, some sort of group of the SSPX breaking off. I personally, after the resistance issues about 10 years ago, where some members of the SSPX kind of left and went off and did their own thing, I don't really think that there's much of a spirit of that in the SSPX right now, from my understanding and from talking to many priests and kind of the who's who knowing what's going on. I don't really see it, but maybe Vigano sees something I don't see. Another line that's very interesting here, though, is where he says official church. When he says traditional Catholicism no longer represented within the official church. Now, this is a line that will have some of the critics of Bishop Vigano basically saying he's separating kind of the mystical element of the church from the ecclesial element of the church, from the hierarchs, from the prelates, and so forth, and kind of bifurcating the church into different pieces. And this is admittedly something that makes some commentators nervous. But I did see an interesting analysis here today from Edward Fazer, who's an excellent Catholic philosopher. And I'll find his tweet here. And he went over something actually from Cardinal Newman, great saintly cardinal of English Catholic history. And he said, Newman held that the teaching function of the church was suspended during the Arian crisis. Do the Pope's plans for the reforming DDF imply a similar suspension? And you can look at it in here, and I've read much of this article earlier. Basically, we won't go through all of it here. I recommend you read it. Basically, the thesis that he's putting forth that was Cardinal Newman's idea was that during the Arian crisis, there was such disarray within the Catholic hierarchy that, in essence, the teaching function of the church kind of shut off. I don't really know how that works. He does have, it's kind of above my pay grade, but it seems to be something that Cardinal Newman was talking about. And I do trust Dr. Fazer. I think he's a very esteemed Catholic philosopher. I think he has been pretty kind to the Society of St. Pius X in his opinions. And he says one thing here is a quote from Newman that I find very fascinating. Excuse me. He says, there was a temporary suspension of the functions of the Ecclesia Docens, which is a teaching church. The body of bishops failed in their confession of the faith. They spoke variously, one against another. There was nothing after Nicaea of firm, unvarying, consistent testimony for nearly 60 years. He goes on to say, Newman goes on to make it clear that he is not saying that the Pope and bishops lost the power to teach, and in a way that was protected from error when exercised in an ex cathedra fashion. Rather, while they retained that power, they simply did not use it. I think this is extremely fascinating. And I personally, from my quick view of this earlier today, I think this could be applied to our time. And maybe this is something that Bishop Vigano is getting at, where we see this bifurcation between the official church, sort of the personnel, the institutional visibility, let's say, and the actual retention of the faith, if that makes sense. And what Newman is saying, if I can understand it correctly, is that the way that we see that the Holy Ghost had protected the church is that even when there was widespread heresy or pseudo-heresy accepted by the hierarchy with the Arian crisis, at the same time, aside from the Council of Nicaea, there was really nothing that was promulgated that was de fide, that was necessary to believe to the faithful. And if you look at our times, especially since the Second Vatican Council, that's exactly how it's been. The last sort of de fide binding proclamation from Rome that was, thrust upon us under the pain of mortal sin, so to speak, for good reason, obviously, because it was a dogma that was being defined and it was a traditional dogma, was under Pius XII with the Assumption dogma, the Assumption of Mary. But there's been a continual debate since that time about which teachings are binding on the faithful. With the Second Vatican Council, we have something very fascinating where, of course, it is a pastoral council. Yes, there are many things that are said in the council that are a repetition or a representation of dogmas of the faith that we have to believe. You know, there's an expression that the SSPX implements 95% of the Second Vatican Council because 95% of the council was just Catholicism, whereas the modernist bishops implement the 5% of novelty and forget the other 95%. But the fascinating thing about Vatican II is that there are no anathematized statements, or no anathema statements in the documents, and it was very clear in the Nota Previas, I believe that's the proper term, that no dogmas were defined in the council. So as important as the council has been in a sociological perspective, the actual contents of the council has been continuously debated since the time of the Second Vatican Council. And for a long time, it was seen as a big faux pas if you wanted to say, well, I'm not going to follow every jot and tittle of Vatican II, and you were called a schismatic or whatever. But then, very interestingly, and this was the opinion of traditionalists like Archbishop Lefebvre and so forth, very interestingly, it was in 2015, and it was Archbishop Pozzo, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but you can find that in my book, SSPX, The Defense. Archbishop Pozzo was in charge of the Ecclesia Dei communities in some capacity, and he came out and was very clear that one can sort of disagree with certain documents in the Second Vatican Council, and there was no problem with that. And he pointed specifically to the documents where they talked about the nature of other religions and of religious liberty. Because, and he said, these present sort of novelties. Therefore, they can't necessarily be binding on the faithful. And this echoed what Pope Benedict had said, where he said, I believe it was Gaudium et Spes, had represented a sort of counter-syllabus, meaning what was found in this document from Vatican II seemed to be in contrast what was put out by Pope Pius IX and in his Syllabus of Errors. And the Syllabus of Errors was a binding document. In the Syllabus of Errors, I recommend you read it if you haven't, you find in there, host of propositions, and if anyone thinks X, Y, and Z, let him be anathema. If anyone says A, B, and C, let him be anathema. This is using the teaching office in a very explicit way, which is binding on Catholics. Whereas you look to, for example, Nostra Aetate in the document in the Second Vatican Council on world religions, so-called, you find statements about the religions that are not really catechetical at all and can't really be bound on the consciences of Catholics because they don't really represent Catholic teaching anyway. For example, there's a description of Buddhism. There's a description of Hinduism. And these comments aren't even really exhaustive about Buddhism or Hinduism, and they don't really represent anything that could be binding on Catholics because they're kind of like sociological opinions about how some people view other religions, not Catholic dogma. And if we look at what's happened, and that's just one example, but if we look at what's happened since the Second Vatican Council, there have been a host of encyclicals and things like that from popes, but as far as I'm concerned, we can't find anathemas or solemn definitions and so forth. And I really think that what Edward Feser is saying here, and bravo to him for finding this information from Cardinal Newman, and I did read the original citation from Newman yesterday as well, and he links to it here. But bravo to him, because basically what he's saying is Cardinal Newman looked at a period in church history where there was massive doctrinal confusion, and he noticed a trend in that the Holy Ghost had protected the church insofar as the Catholics were not bound to believe certain things in the normal way they were bound to it. This doesn't mean that many souls weren't lost. This doesn't mean that there wasn't a lot of confusion. This doesn't mean that it wasn't disaster. But it does mean in the sense of the indefectibility of the church, at least in this instance, that was not harmed because it wasn't as if the popes or the bishops came out and said, you ought to believe heresy. And in a technical sense, it seems like something like that has happened in our time since the Second Vatican Council. Anyway, I find this fascinating. So I would recommend everyone check out this blog at Edward Feser's website, and it's called edwardfeser.blogspot.com. It's very good. Cardinal Newman is an amazing resource to read to understand our times. He did a lot of work on the Arian crisis, very applicable to our time. And Cardinal Newman did have a lot of musings about sort of the extension of the Pope's authority and so forth. Very, very relevant, saintly author for our time. So anyway, as always, let me know what you think in the comments. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.